On the 1st of December 2025, in Burkina Faso, Oprah Winfrey, the globally renowned talk show host, conducted a special interview with President Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who has been making waves across Africa. At first, their conversation focused on the nation's instability and the awakening of millions across the continent. But then, something unexpected happened. Oprah directly asked Traoré, "What do you think about the Catholic faith and about Jesus Christ?" A question that seemed simple suddenly pushed the entire interview in a completely different direction, and Traoré's answer left Oprah Winfrey stunned, speechless. If you want to know why his response was so shocking, stay tuned for the next part of the story. Oprah Winfrey began by clarifying something important. "I did not come here today for politics," she said softly. "I came to understand your faith and why it has touched millions of people around the world so powerfully." Traoré nodded with the calm of someone who had waited a very long time to speak a truth that few had dared to ask him about. Then he shared a conviction so firm that it almost unsettled Oprah. He explained that the original message of Christianity was liberation, a spiritual revolution created to break chains, not forge new ones. But over centuries, institutions had transformed it into something else. People built walls, created hierarchies. Rituals replaced the living connection with God. Human beings learned to cling to doctrine while forgetting compassion. "Jesus came to free the human spirit," he said, but humans reshaped his message to serve their own agendas. His voice carried no accusation. It was reflective, like someone examining a wound with honesty rather than bitterness. He spoke of how prayer had become loud while love had grown silent, how religious gatherings grew in number, but justice did not grow with them, how scripture was memorized, yet mercy forgotten. Oprah felt something shift in her chest as he spoke. This was not rhetoric. This was a man describing a fracture running through the heart of humanity's spiritual life, a fracture he had watched form since childhood. Traoré continued. "Many pastors lived in wealth while their congregations starved. Many communities sang hymns with passion but ignored the suffering just outside their church doors. The temple had become a place of performance rather than transformation. Faith," he said, "had become a badge, something to declare, not something to embody." He leaned forward, his voice small but unshakably clear. "When people pray but do not love, their prayer becomes noise. When they preach but do not serve, their preaching becomes empty." Oprah swallowed hard. She had interviewed presidents, kings, cultural icons, and spiritual leaders for decades, but she had never heard anyone speak about religion with such simplicity and depth, without condemnation, without shaming, without theatrics. Just truth, pure yet gentle. Then he went deeper still, revealing that this crisis of faith was not only a modern issue, it had been woven into the continent's history. Many of the wounds Africans carried began when foreign powers brought Christianity with two faces, a face of salvation and a face of domination. He paused. Oprah sensed that beneath his words lay more memory, more history, more truth that had been waiting for the right moment and the right listener to emerge. The air in the room seemed to tighten, as though preparing itself for what was about to be said. Oprah drew a slow breath, steadying herself. She realized she was not simply interviewing a head of state. She was listening to a man who had watched his people's spiritual identity torn apart and was now trying to stitch it back together with honesty, courage, and something that felt very much like love. And just as that thought settled in her mind, Traoré spoke again, softly but sharply. "We must look at how faith came to us, because that story is not simple, and it is not as innocent as many believe." Oprah felt the ground of the conversation shift. This was no longer about doctrine. This was about history. This was about truth. And what she was about to hear next would reveal a deeper layer, one buried under centuries of memory and loss. What came next did not feel like a political statement. It felt like a wound opening a wound older than the nations carved on modern maps. Traoré spoke of the moment Christianity first arrived on African soil, not as a gentle offering of hope, but as a paradox with two faces. One face spoke of love, forgiveness, and the God who sees all people as equal. The other face carried the weight of empire, conquest, and the quiet erasure of entire cultures. Oprah leaned in, sensing that the conversation had crossed the threshold into something far deeper than theology. He told her a story passed down from his grandmother. In her village, the missionary arrived holding a Bible in one hand and the colonial flag in the other. It was a symbol so stark, so honest in its contradiction, that Oprah felt her breath catch. "When they told us to close our eyes and pray," Traoré said, "the land beneath our feet was taken." His voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble. He spoke with the stillness of someone who had inherited both the trauma and the clarity that comes after the trauma is finally named. Oprah felt something break inside her, not guilt, not defensiveness, but recognition, the recognition that a story can be both beautiful and violent at the same time, and that millions had lived with that contradiction in silence. Traoré continued, "The missionaries demanded that villagers abandon their languages, rituals, and the spiritual traditions that had guided their ancestors for thousands of years. They were taught that holiness came from elsewhere, not from within, that God lived in foreign cathedrals, not in the wind, the soil, or the heartbeat of the land itself. Faith should free people," Traoré said quietly. "But for many of us, it became the tool used to make us forget who we were." Oprah's eyes softened. She had spent a lifetime exploring human stories, but this one cut through her in a way she had not expected. It wasn't only historical, it was personal, collective, ancestral. She realized that the man sitting before her was speaking not just for himself, but for an entire continent that had carried its spiritual identity in fragments. And then came the sentence that struck her deepest. "We did not need to be saved, we already had faith." For the first time, Oprah's hands trembled slightly. This was not defiance. This was reclamation. This was a people standing up not against God, but against the idea that their relationship with the divine had ever been inferior. The room felt different now, denser, more electric. It was as if the ancestors themselves were listening. Oprah looked at Traoré, but she was also looking at something larger, the long, unspoken truth that Africa had carried into the 21st century. What she saw in him was not anger, it was liberation. As the conversation deepened, Oprah realized she was no longer just interviewing a leader. She was witnessing the spiritual unbinding of a people, reclaiming their voice, their dignity, and their memory. And she understood instinctively that the world would not remain silent once these words were heard. And it was in the quiet of the following morning that she finally understood why so many in Burkina Faso saw Ibrahim Traoré not just as a president, but as a reminder of who they had always been. The next morning rose gently over Ouagadougou. The city had not yet awakened, but Oprah had. The night offered her no rest, only reflection. She walked outside barefoot, letting the cool dew settle between her toes. The air tasted different here, as if it carried memories older than the written word. She followed a narrow path until she saw him. Ibrahim Traoré sat beneath a towering baobab tree, its ancient branches stretching upward like a living cathedral. He wasn't surrounded by ministers, advisors, or bodyguards. He sat alone, holding a small leather-bound notebook, its edges worn smooth by time. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said as Oprah approached. He wrote the things he didn't want the world to forget. He opened the notebook and handed it to her. The pages were filled with simple lines, almost too simple for the weight they carried. "If you want to see God, look at the wind. If you want to feel God, listen to the rain. If you want to know God, look into the eyes of a child." Oprah closed the book slowly, her heart aching with a quiet recognition. She had spent decades speaking to millions, yet this moment, under a tree with a man half her age, reading wisdom from a man twice her age, felt more instructive than all her interviews combined. Traoré explained that before foreign religions arrived, African spirituality had always been anchored in nature, community, and harmony. Faith wasn't a doctrine, it was a relationship, a way of living that connected the living with their ancestors, the land, and the divine presence in everything. "When they separated us from nature," he said, "they separated us from ourselves." He spoke gently, but Oprah felt the political implications woven beneath his words. A people disconnected from their identity become easier to rule. A nation stripped of its spiritual memory becomes easier to control. The consequences were not only religious, they were civilizational. And yet, something remarkable was happening in Burkina Faso under his leadership. People were reclaiming their stories. Communities were beginning to honor their traditions openly again. Schools were teaching both modern education and ancestral knowledge. Elders once ignored were becoming spiritual guides. It wasn't a return to the past, it was the healing of a fracture. Oprah realized then that what the world often labeled as political rebellion was, in truth, a spiritual renaissance, a people rediscovering the sacredness of their existence, a continent refusing to let external powers define the essence of their faith. Traoré looked toward the horizon as he spoke the next line. When religion serves power, it stops serving God. And when it stops serving God, it stops serving humanity. Those words carried the weight of centuries. Oprah could sense that this was not about defying Christianity or any religion. It was about restoring integrity to the human soul. He explained that many Africans had been taught that God lived in a distant heaven, far removed from earthly life, but his grandfather believed otherwise. God is not far, Traoré said. We are far, and the journey is simply returning. Oprah exhaled slowly. She felt as if she had been handed a map, one she didn't know she had been searching for. And as the tree's branches swayed above them, she understood that the consequences of this spiritual awakening would ripple far beyond Burkina Faso. This was not only a civil movement, it was not only political, it was existential. But the world outside Africa was about to react, and that reaction would reveal just how unprepared humanity was for a leader who spoke about faith with this kind of clarity. When Oprah returned to the United States, the world she stepped back into no longer felt the same. The noise of everyday American life, the rush, the commentary, the endless debates, suddenly seemed hollow compared to the silence beneath the baobab tree in Burkina Faso. She went home, sat at her desk, and opened her journal. But the words did not come easily. They came like a confession. I did not interview a president, she wrote. I encountered a truth-teller, and it unsettled me. For nights she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Traoré's voice echoing, "Too many people worship the finger, not the moon." And she knew exactly what he meant. Humanity had become obsessed with symbols, religious titles, institutions, rituals, while forgetting the deeper spiritual reality those symbols once pointed to. When the interview aired, the world ignited. It appeared first on major African news platforms, then spread across Europe, South America, and eventually every corner of the American media landscape. Millions watched as Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader from Burkina Faso, spoke about faith with a courage that felt almost radical in its simplicity. The reactions were immediate and polarized. They praised him as a leader, unafraid to confront the uncomfortable truths of history. They said Traoré had articulated something Africa had always felt but rarely voiced. They admired how he spoke about Christianity not to destroy it, but to restore its integrity. In the comments across global African news networks, thousands wrote, "He is saying what our elders whispered. This is the first time a leader speaks of God without fear." Burkina Faso has awakened something in all of us. Some religious institutions accused him of undermining the church. Some Western commentators called him too bold, too disruptive, or too idealistic. Others dismissed his words as political posturing, without understanding that he was speaking from a historical wound, not an ideological agenda. Meanwhile, scholars, historians, and theologians praised the interview as a turning point. They noted that he had expressed, in plain language, what decades of academic research had been unable to convey to the public. That colonization reshaped African spirituality in ways that still affect the continent today. That reclaiming faith was not rebellion, it was recovery. In universities across the U.S., students began citing the interview in lectures on religion, decolonization, and ethics. Professors described Traoré's voice as one of the most important moral perspectives coming out of Africa today. For many Americans, especially those over 40, who had lived through cultural shifts, religious conflicts, and national soul-searching, his message felt startlingly relevant. They were asking themselves questions Oprah had asked under the baobab. Are we practicing faith or performing it? Have our religious institutions grown louder than our compassion? What does it mean to believe in God and still be divided by fear? And perhaps most strikingly, why did it take a young leader from Burkina Faso to remind the world what faith was supposed to be? This was no longer just an interview. It had become a mirror for Christians questioning the sincerity of modern worship, a mirror for Americans wrestling with moral fatigue, a mirror for a world searching desperately for meaning beyond rituals and institutions. And through all the noise, support, backlash, praise, condemnation, one truth became clear. Ibrahim Traoré had spoken a universal language, the language of spiritual honesty in a world terrified of it. But even as global attention swirled around him, Traoré himself remained calm. And what he would say next back home in Burkina Faso would reveal why his words carried such extraordinary weight. What happened next was not expected, not by Oprah, not by the American public, and certainly not by the institutions that believed they understood the world's spiritual architecture. The global reaction to the interview had already been intense, but it was the aftershock that revealed the true magnitude of its impact. While commentators in the West were still debating the meaning of his words, something else began unfolding quietly across Burkina Faso. Community gatherings multiplied. Elders who had long been ignored were invited to speak again. Young people, inspired by the interview circulating on Africa News, began studying their ancestral traditions, not to reject Christianity, but to rediscover the spiritual dignity they felt had been taken from them. It was as if the entire country exhaled a breath it had been holding for generations. When Oprah replayed the footage days later, she noticed something she had missed the first time. It wasn't in his words, it was in his silence. A kind of sovereignty, not political, not military, but spiritual. The sovereignty of someone who does not need to be believed to be true. And then the twist came. During a public gathering in Ouagadougou, standing beneath the same sky where Oprah first met him, Ibrahim Traoré addressed the nation. But instead of speaking about policy or security or economics, he spoke about the soul. Faith, he said, does not belong to Rome, nor Mecca, nor any throne on earth. Faith belongs to the human spirit, and the human spirit is not a colony. Those words rippled across the crowd like a shockwave. Within hours, they appeared as headlines across African news, in French, English, Arabic, and dozens of African languages. Analysts called it bold, critics called it dangerous, supporters called it the beginning of a new era. But it was what he said next that transformed the conversation entirely. For too long, the world has viewed Africa as a receiver of truth, but our ancestors carried truth long before colonization. The time has come for Africa to speak, not as a student, but as a teacher. That sentence, simple, steady, unadorned, shifted the global narrative more than any political declaration could have. Suddenly, the interview with Oprah was no longer just a spiritual conversation. It became a symbolic moment, marking a redistribution of moral authority. A leader from a young nation, Burkina Faso was inviting the world to learn from Africa's spiritual heritage rather than judge it. And for millions across the diaspora, it felt like a reclamation they had waited their entire lives to hear. In the United States, religious scholars remarked that Traoré had reintroduced a long-forgotten idea, that faith is not the property of empires, and that revelation does not flow in only one direction. In Europe, journalists wrote that he had rewired the coordinates of global spirituality. And in Africa, elders whispered that a prophecy was unfolding, that a young leader would rise not through wealth or armies, but through truth. The unexpected twist wasn't merely that Traoré had challenged the distortions of modern religion. It was that he had repositioned Africa as a spiritual axis in the world's search for meaning. Burkina Faso, once dismissed in international politics, had suddenly become a reference point for a global conversation about faith. And Ibrahim Traoré, mentioned in countless African news analyses, was no longer just a president. He had become a symbol, a reminder that spiritual authority does not come from age or title, but from integrity. Oprah felt this shift deeply. She realized she had traveled to Burkina Faso seeking answers. But she returned to America with a revelation. The world had been looking in the wrong direction for far too long. And as Traoré's final message began to echo across continents, the stage was set for a closing chapter that would speak not just to Africa, but to all humanity. In the quiet that followed the global storm, one truth remained. The conversation between Oprah Winfrey and Ibrahim Traoré was never meant to end in a room, or under a baobab tree, or even on the screens of millions watching through African news. It was meant to echo across nations, across faiths, across every heart that had ever wondered where God truly lives. Oprah returned to her journal one last time. "He did not teach me anything new," she wrote. "He reminded me of what the world forgot." And in Burkina Faso, as dawn broke once more, Traoré knelt in silent prayer, not for power, not for victory, but for understanding, for a humanity courageous enough to see divinity not in buildings or titles, but in each other. God is not far, he whispered. We are the ones returning. His final message to the world became a quiet prophecy. We do not ask permission to be free. We rise, because the truth was always ours. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touched your heart today, share this story. And if you believe Africa's rising voice deserves to be heard, subscribe, because the journey of a world no longer bowed begins here. God bless Africa.